This morning from Cal State Channel Islands is Professor Dr. Stephen Clark, who's a Spanish professor and an expert on Cuba. And of course, first of all, good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you for
Thanks
being
for having
here. We obviously, Cuba has been much in the news the last couple of weeks after before and after the president's trip, even before that when he started to work towards normalizing relations with Cuba after so many years. And at this point, first of all, how do you, as someone who is an expert on Cuba, understand the country and all, how do you see what the president did? How do you view his decision to try to normalize relations, reestablish diplomatic relations after, 50 years or so?
Well, I think it's a very understandable move on the president's part because, as he says, and rightly so, 50-plus years of embargo haven't done much to improve the everyday life of the average Cuban, and the embargo has often been used as a crutch by the Cuban regime to say the reason we have all the problems that we have is because of the embargo. And they call it actually a blockade rather than an embargo. They put it in more dramatic terms. So everything in Cuba is as hard as it is because of the embargo. So that's one thing Obama emphasized when he went there is, we're not your enemies. We want to improve our ties. I want the embargo to be lifted. So we'll see what happens. But it was a gesture on the president's part to say, what we've been doing hasn't helped the Cuban people. Let's see if we can change course and give them some hope for things changing in the future with increased economic ties and increased tourism.
Will that, do you think, loosen up sort of the tight hold that the Castro regime has had on that island nation for all these years? Or do you think, and I know we've heard statements that would indicate that they plan to hold on just as tight as ever while taking advantage of the tourism and the trade? How do you see the future for Cuba?
Well, I think it's a bit too early to know what will happen, but what we have seen so far from reports of news people from different media going to Cuba during the president's visit, all of them have reported that the Cuban people seem to be less fearful than they have in the recent past. And although there are still a lot of detentions and harassment of people who speak their mind, they tend to be much more short-term detentions than long-term. And with the increased amount of tourism, people hopefully will be having more economic power and being less dependent on the government. So that's the plan in terms of the U.S. promoting business ties, is to give people more economic opportunity, which hopefully will translate into more political opportunity, more political freedom as time goes by. But we'll have to wait and see.
How, over the years during the embargo, all these years, how much did the Cuban people surreptitiously stay in contact with the Western world of the United States? Radio broadcasts, things like that. I mean, I get the feeling that a lot of folks over there really, knew a lot about what was going on over here, even though the government didn't want them to know.
Oh, yeah, for many years. And even today, you can pick up the strongest stations, AM stations from Miami, and with so much Cuban-American, Cuban contact between relatives, there's been a lot of coming and going in terms of family ties. But recently, ever since the internet became a worldwide phenomenon, the Cuban government has not allowed people to have much access to the internet. So what the Cuban people have done to get around that is they sell something called el paquete, which is the package, which are hard drives or flash drive memories with news and TV shows and movies. Every week, all throughout the island, they circulate this thing called el paquete, which goes from person to person around the whole country, people having access to what's going on outside of Cuba. So they've really been sort of creative to try to get around that. And they are, despite the isolation, they are pretty aware of a lot of things that are going on in the world.
Let's talk about what this is all going to mean in terms of lifting the embargo and reestablishing relationship with Cuba for most Americans. First of all, everything I've read up to now is pretty confusing as to whether or not the average American can can go over there and be a tourist or not. Where do things stand now, and how soon might it become viable for just the average person to go to Cuba?
Right, that's a really good question, because tourism is still actually not legal. The embargo is still in effect. However, commercial flights will be starting in the fall, and the prices will be coming down a lot. There is technically no longer a license required from the Treasury Department to go to Cuba, but you have to be in one of the 12 to 15 categories of people who have a legitimate reason to go there. What most people listening today might fit under in terms of categories is something called people-to-people tours, which means you're going there to learn more about Cuba, to have contact with the people, but not just to go to the beach and drink mojitos. So the irony is, for example, Carnival Cruises, starting next month, is going to have a 3-stop cruise to Cuba from Florida. And the whole idea of a cruise sounds like a vacation, but technically tourism is still illegal. You can go to Cuba as a people-to-people type ambassador, learning more about the country. You can stay with a Cuban family. You can go on to Airbnb and look at all the different places where you could stay. There's actually cell phone service now with Verizon and Sprint through roaming, which is recent. Credit and debit cards from the U.S. are now taken if you go there, but if you do go, you should bring a lot of cash because it's not very extended. But technically, tourism is still not allowed.
What about the other direction? Are Cubans going to be allowed to come to the United States, visit?
Sure. The problem is Cubans, like most people from Latin America who come to the U.S., they need to have a visa. So what Cubans have been doing, and this is interesting, since relations have been reestablished, many Cubans have been coming to the U.S. worried that the wet foot, dry foot policy is going to end, which is traditionally Cubans since about 25 years ago have been allowed to come to the U.S. If they can reach the shore, if they can reach the Mexican border, they get to come in. But just to give you an idea, last year, 2015, 44,000 Cubans arrived at the U.S. border without a visa and were accepted through the wet foot, dry foot policy. And the year before was just 26,000. So many Cubans are seeing the renewed ties as perhaps a reason why the wet foot, dry foot policy would be eliminated, and they want to come as soon as they can. But now a lot of Cubans are coming to visit family, and more than in recent years, because in 2013 the government started to let them come without a special permission card.
What's the population of Cuba?
It's about 11.5 million people.
All right, so that's like a quarter of the California population.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And the country is probably about as large as the state of California?
It's about 700 miles from coast to coast.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And how many people probably over the years, since it all started with Castro in 59-ish,
mm-hmm.
how many people probably have fled Cuba over that 50-year period?
The estimated number is over 2 million Cuban citizens living in exile right now. So that's a pretty big chunk of the overall country's population.
I just remember Teofilo Stevens, the great boxer. We always wanted Muhammad Ali to fight
That's
him.
right.
It almost happened. It almost happened, but it didn't. I think he won 4 golds because he just kept rolling through. And now we have Puig. We've got and most of them seem to come in like via Mexico to avoid the contract issues and some other things. So our response, Arturo Sandoval, we look at all the great artists, all the great culture. And when you take a cruise ship, hey, want a Cuban cigar? Hand rolled like it. It's just funny to think of just all the little things that we know about Cuba, and and what it means to our culture, but what an impact this would have on us if we started doing trade with them.
Yeah, traditionally there's been many ties between our two countries, and I've heard recently, I read something that said, if you go to Cuba, it's truly the shortest distance you'll ever travel to enter an entirely different world. But at the same time, it's always been, up until 50 years ago, a very close part of the American experience, especially on the East Coast, almost a vacation destination, almost like going to Florida at one point. So.
Yeah, and if you look at, I always go pop culture, Rich is one of the important questions, but think of, I Love Lucy, for crying out loud, exactly. How that was brought into our culture, and that's what people thought, that's a great culture that they have.
Well, one last question. Optimistic or pessimistic about the future of Cuba?
Well, I'm optimistic about the Cuban people because they've shown themselves to be tremendously resilient and creative and very willing to accept the challenge of all the hardships they've had. But I'm not so optimistic about the current Cuban government. So we'll have to keep our fingers crossed and hope for the best.
Dr. Stephen Clark, thank you very much for being here today. Appreciate that. A Spanish professor at Cal State Channel Island and an expert on Cuba.
Professor.
And, do you have courses that you teach about Cuba?
Well, actually, right now I'm teaching a course with our Osher Lifelong Learning Institute for 50-plus students, and that's an introduction to Cuba called Cuba 101. And we have had a lot of interest in that because of all the news related to Cuba right now. But I have taught Cuban literature and film on the campus, and I've taken groups to Cuba from Channel Island. So hopefully we'll be able to do that in the future with a little bit less paperwork and bureaucracy.
Thank you, Dr. Clark, for being here. Appreciate it. Kim, what's happening elsewhere?
All righty. On April 5th at 6 p.m. at the John Spoor Broom Library, we're going to light it up